back in 2016, Roland dealt with the Greenbelt consultation, and at that time the site was seen as sort of linked to the community woodlands, as almost like, well, we're going to look at this as one site and explore leisure opportunities, because that was the direction of the policy framework. Obviously, leisure opportunities are limited by the site's proximity to the A1M. But even so, leisure opportunities are very much in our mind, and in the past, when W.S. Atkins looked at the site options, one option which was put forward was of a snow dome, and eventually that went to Leeds and so on, really because of the constraints that policy placed on anything that could be considered. Although the site is previously developed in terms of mineral development, so reading the policy framework, I'm not sure how much you can read into the actual words, but mineral may well count as previously developed site. Certainly on the OS map, the site area is referred to as unused workings. So back in the day, English partnerships were sort of looking at it very much as one site potentially inviting proposals, but the fact was it was in mineral development at that stage, mineral production at that stage. And then the restoration supervised by Wardles took place. So Greenbelt, potentially at the time, I think Roland was arguing for a Greenbelt release just to safeguard the land against potential future need. And I think the rationale with that, with Roland's thinking, if I can speak for him for a moment, is very much in terms of housing need and housing numbers. And I think we'll come on to that. And I think probably what I'll do, because all these thoughts are a bit linked, rather than take the whole meeting over them, I'll just sort of gallop through them, if I may, just as a sort of overview. So, Greenbelt, ideally a master plan for the whole site. It's a big site. It's attractive to investors because the mineral ownership and the surface ownership are in the same hand. And the land is undivided, so that is attractive. A whole site proposal. Land use currently ADAS stroke DEFRA in the mix on the land use. An SFI contract has been inked, and we're paid to farm the land basically. So ADAS have assessed the land as grade 4, grade 5 farmland. Back in the day when mineral planning was first issued, there were always questions about the agricultural restoration. The land back in the day was, I think, grade 3, because it was limestone underneath and a relatively small depth of topsoil. And that's evident in woodlands where you have gardens with about a foot of topsoil, and then you go down to the limestone. So the topsoil available was always thin, and it got thinner when the community woodlands were developed. I think that's where a lot of our topsoil went. But even so, over the years with the agricultural tenants, we have improved the depth of topsoil to the point that tractors are getting stuck on it, which I think is encouraging. So, so that's where we are in land use. Constraints, levels. The site divides between sort of hillside going from 50 metres down to 33 metres, and an extensive flat area. And certainly when sort of Ed Miliband visited, it was possible to walk straight to the centre of the site, down the Type 1 track. And, you know, he sort of did the 360 and just went, gosh, wow, it's very flat, isn't it? So, so we have, in terms of levels, within the site, we don't have very much to do, should it ever be required. And you know, in terms of engineering, which is, you know, obviously the bit that interests me, there are no level issues that I can see, certainly compared to Midland Quarry, which was a very deep granite quarry. There are no particular level issues. So particularly these days, the Chinese are very good at dealing with levels, because they're dealing with mountains and hairpins and all the rest of it. So there's nothing here that is tricky, and from the engineering aspect, where it joins in with the planning, is that it can be done in such a way that it's very unobtrusive in the greenbelt, that you don't have to sort of produce a sort of you know, huge roundabout. There are ways of doing things which basically using steel sections, which can be you know, very quickly bring the site to a level. So there's that. Contamination, I think we dealt with. We've had a sort of micro proposal to put a sort of maintenance barn at the Green Lane access, and that's been very helpful because we've worked through a number of planning issues as to whether contamination's an issue. You know, we've sort of got good evidence on that from the aerial photography and the mineral working, and we have a warranty from British Coal that there's no pollution. But obviously any site like this, there could be low-level oils from mineral working, and you never know. I mean, the site's been adjacent to the colliery since 1906, so you never quite know that you're in the clear, but any pollution's going to be pretty much contained to conservation areas across the site. Highways, I think there is an interesting point here, which is that the A1 is at capacity, and there are, you know, proposals to deal with that, but as ever, it's a question of national priorities and money, which, you know, there never is very much of that. So that potentially, from the planning viewpoint, is quite interesting, because the highways connection to junction 37 and 38 probably helps the site quite a bit compared to competing sites to the south. In that, you know, large-scale housing proposals to the south will feed into that bottleneck, and that sort of runs into the planning, the policy framework of saying, right, well, we're not going to do anything that puts stress on the national network. So this, I think, this site probably scores quite highly on that, because should housing be required on a site, the you know, 30 minutes to quality jobs in Sheffield and Leeds, without putting stress on the A1M, you know, scores it quite highly. So there's just that on the highways. Another sensitivity on the site, of course, is the visual aspect of any highways. and the highways almost sort of divides into two. One is the capacity of the existing access, and two is whether future development may happen at some point in time. And of course, you know, the visual aspects of that are very sensitive. But again, pretty much anything can be done with engineering. I think we probably got scope to limit the visual intrusiveness onto Green Lane in such a way that would be acceptable. So, you know, there's thoughts there. There's also thoughts of a connection through to the Skylarks Grange housing, which again in engineering terms is pretty straightforward. Then the heads, commercial, solar and large-scale housing. Obviously the sort of new thinking has brought large-scale housing into the picture. Solar, it appears there's very considerable unanimity among local politicians of Labour and Conservative. The site has Conservative politicians, but they are very mindful of the deprivation issues in the Labour wards. And you know, there is remarkable unanimity that, as you say, normally you would expect a sort of fairly fractious relationship, but in relation to the site there appears basic unanimity, you know, for whether it be MP, councillors and so on, which is great. I think it's helped that the site, when we come to 10, consultation, there's been extensive consultation. I think I can recall the boards going up in quite early on. I think the W.S. Atkins boards went up and councillors visited them and saw them. I think at the same time as we put the boards up for English Partnerships and Midland Quarry. So there's been extensive consultation based on the W.S. Atkins master plan, really from quite early on. I think that may even be 1999 that councillors saw it. I think Persimmon displayed them to locals in 2003. So there is this sort of collective memory of, oh, well, that's where the housing might have gone in terms of consultation. And we've maintained a pretty active Facebook so that, you know, anyone who wants to have a conversation about it can do so. And, you know, we haven't run into the sort of uproar that other proposals have attracted. You know, I think that's encouraging. Flooding, of course, is an absolutely key issue. If the agenda has moved on to large-scale housing, Doncaster obviously has limited options because of flooding. Again, there's a constraint because of the A1. So the site, with its sort of levels of 50 metres above sea level to 28, you know, again scores extremely highly on flooding without intruding, and that sort of loops in, and then I'll shut up, that loops back to the green belt, in that large-scale housing could be accommodated without intruding onto the openness of the green belt, because the colliery spoil heaps, as greened, are strong green belt boundaries. Nothing's going to go through them. The Green Lane is a strong green belt boundary, as is the A1M, and the site is surrounded on 3 sides now by housing. So overall, the impact on the green belt openness is very limited. So